Everyone at that table looked up at me when my own son said those words. Then the server came around the corner and set a check for $6,200 right in front of my chair, like it had already been decided who was going to cover it. I looked at my son. I looked at that check. Then I picked it up, folded it once, and set it back down in front of him without saying a single word. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out through the front door into the cold November air. Nobody sitting at that table that night knew that the building they were eating in had my name on the original deed. My name is Raymond Kowalski. I'm 63 years old. I spent 35 years as a union electrician, the kind of man who shows up before sunrise and leaves after dark, and comes home with calluses on his hands and the smell of copper wire on his clothes. I raised my son Marcus, mostly by myself after his mother, Diane, left when he was 12. I'm not a man who impresses people at first glance. I drive a truck with a cracked dashboard, and I wear the same 3 flannels in rotation from October through March. But I built more than people ever gave me credit for. And the night of my son's business dinner in Charleston is where every bit of it finally came into the light. Diane left in the summer. Marcus had just finished 6th grade and was supposed to go to baseball camp in July. And I had to sit him down at the kitchen table and explain that camp wasn't going to happen that year, that some things were going to be different for a while. I didn't tell him why his mother had gone. He was 12 and he didn't need to carry that. I told him she needed some time and that everything was going to be fine. And then I went into the bathroom and turned on the shower so he wouldn't hear me. I had a mortgage on a house in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a pickup truck payment, and a son who needed new cleats for fall baseball. So I picked up every overtime shift the union hall had, and I drove 40 minutes each way to job sites in the dark, and I made sure Marcus had lunch money in his pocket and clean clothes on his back every single morning. There were stretches where I ate peanut butter sandwiches for a week straight so the grocery budget could cover what he actually wanted. He never knew that. I made sure he never knew that. I wanted him to feel like the ground under his feet was solid even when I was pretty sure it wasn't. Marcus was a sharp kid, the kind who figured things out fast and got restless when things moved too slow. He wasn't passionate about much through middle school, but when he hit high school, he got a part-time job at a catering company his junior year just to have spending money, and something clicked for him in those kitchens. He'd come home talking about event layouts and client management and vendor negotiations like other kids talked about video games. By senior year, he was shadowing the owner of the company on weekends, asking questions nobody had taught him to ask. I remember driving him to a bridal expo in Harrisburg when he was 17 because he wanted to see how event companies marketed themselves. We sat in those bleacher seats together for 3 hours, and on the drive home, he talked the whole way about what he'd do differently, what gaps he saw in the market. I thought, there it is. That's the thing that's going to take him somewhere. And I told him I'd back him whatever it cost. He went to a hospitality management program at a university in Virginia, and I covered what his aid package didn't touch. I picked up side jobs on weekends, small electrical work for neighbors, rewiring old houses, generator installations, whatever paid cash. I never mentioned the side jobs to Marcus. He thought the tuition just worked itself out. When he graduated, he came back to Pennsylvania with a business plan already written and a head full of ambition, wanting to open his own event venue instead of working his way up managing somebody else's banquet hall for a decade the way everybody told him to do. He was 24. No assets. No credit history worth presenting to a bank. Every lender he approached turned him down flat. That's when he called me on a Wednesday night and asked if we could talk. He drove over and sat across from me at the kitchen table, turning his coffee mug in circles the way he used to do with his cereal bowl when he was nervous as a kid. He needed collateral. He needed someone with equity and a solid credit score to co-sign on a commercial property loan, and there was exactly one person in his life who fit that description. I didn't make him finish asking. I'd spent 35 years building things for other people's buildings, and here was a chance to help him build something that was actually his. I told him yes. I meant it without any hesitation at all. I had no way of knowing that yes would cost me a lot more than I was ready for. The property was a converted textile mill in Charleston, South Carolina, a city Marcus had fallen in love with during a college internship. The building had original hardwood floors and 16-foot ceilings and tall windows that caught the afternoon light in a way that made it easy to picture weddings and corporate events and everything Marcus had been planning in his head for 2 years. I drove down to Charleston, walked through that building with him and his real estate agent, and stood in the middle of that empty floor while Marcus pointed at every wall and told me what it was going to become. I co-signed a commercial property loan for $1.8 million. I signed a personal guarantee that put my house in Millbrook on the line as additional security. The bank's attorney set up a holding structure where I held 35% ownership in the venture, kept quiet on paper while Marcus held the rest and managed everything day to day. Marcus asked me the same night we signed to keep my stake private. He said investors and corporate clients responded better to a clean founder story, a young entrepreneur who built something from scratch on his own talent. He said having his electrician father listed as a part owner might undercut the brand he was trying to build. I told myself that was just smart business thinking, and I agreed to stay in the background. The venue opened 18 months later under the name Ironwood Hall. The reviews came fast and good. Within 2 years, Marcus had expanded into a second location in Savannah, and regional wedding publications started naming Ironwood Hall as one of the premier event venues in the South. Every profile told some version of the same story. Young founder, no safety net, built from nothing but vision and grit. I read every article. My name wasn't in a single one. I told myself it didn't matter. It was around year 3 that Marcus met the Whitfields at a charity gala Ironwood Hall hosted. The Whitfields were old Charleston money, the kind of family with a carriage house older than most American cities and a genealogy that showed up in history books. Carter Whitfield, the patriarch, had built a commercial real estate portfolio that stretched from Charleston to Atlanta, and he valued pedigree and self-reliance the way other people valued religion. His daughter Sloane was 30, quick-minded, and had the kind of easy confidence that comes from never once wondering whether you belong in a room. Marcus fell into that world the way water finds its level. When he and Sloane got engaged the following spring, I drove down to Charleston for the announcement dinner at the Whitfield family home. Carter Whitfield shook my hand across a dining room table that probably cost more than my truck, and Marcus introduced me to him as an old family friend who'd believed in him early on. Not his father, a family friend who'd believed in him. I smiled and said it was wonderful news, and I meant the part about the engagement. I let the other part go the way I'd been letting things go. I told myself it would change once the wedding settled down. I was wrong about that too. 2 years passed with me flying down to Charleston for holidays and birthdays and sitting at the edges of gatherings, watching Marcus work a room the way he'd learned to work a room, shaking hands and telling his story to people who never heard my name in it. I told myself every time that it was fine. I told myself I was fine. I had gotten very good at telling myself things. Then Marcus called in October and invited me to a business dinner at Ironwood Hall's flagship Charleston location. A significant corporate client was finalizing a multi-year contract, and Marcus said it meant a lot to him to have family there for the occasion. I let myself feel something when he said that. A small, careful hope I hadn't let myself feel in a while. I'd been finishing up a rewiring job in Allentown that week, a full commercial job that had run 3 days over schedule. I didn't have time to drive back to Millbrook and change and make the 7-hour drive to Charleston. I called Marcus and told him I was coming straight from the job and asked if that was all right. He said, "Of course, come as you are." I drove 7 hours in my work clothes. Flannel shirt, steel-toed boots, the kind of jeans that tell a story of what kind of work you do. I stopped once for gas and a coffee, and I pulled into Charleston just after 8 in the evening, tired in a way that settles into your bones when you're past 60 and you've been on your feet for 11 hours. But I was also genuinely glad to be going. I hadn't seen Marcus in 3 months. Ironwood Hall at night was something to look at. The original brick exterior lit from below, the tall windows glowing warm from inside, the sound of string music coming through the front doors. I'd walked through that building when it was empty and smelled like old machine oil, and now it looked like the kind of place that shows up on the cover of magazines. I felt something close to pride standing on the sidewalk looking up at it. Pride mixed with the particular ache of something you helped build that no longer seems to know your name. The hostess recognized me, the same young woman who'd been working the front since the Savannah location opened, and she walked me straight back to the private dining room without checking any list. The room was all candlelight and white tablecloths, and the low sound of good conversation. Carter Whitfield sat at the head of the table looking exactly the way men who have always had money tend to look in a room they consider theirs. Sloane sat beside Marcus, her hand on his arm, leaning toward something Carter's business partner was saying. The corporate clients, a group of 4 from a hospitality conglomerate based in Atlanta, sat across the table in the kind of suits that don't wrinkle. Marcus saw me first. I watched his face do something I'd seen it do before. A quick tightening, a recalculation behind the eyes. He stood up and came across the room toward me before I'd made it 3 steps inside the door. He kept his voice low. "Dad, what did you come wearing?" I told him I'd driven straight from Allentown, that I hadn't had time to change, that I was sorry if the clothes weren't right for the room. He glanced back over his shoulder at the table. Carter Whitfield was watching with that particular stillness wealthy men use when they're deciding whether something requires their attention. One of the Atlanta clients leaned toward the other and said something I couldn't hear. Sloane looked down at her wine glass. Marcus turned back to me, and I watched him make the same calculation I'd seen him make at his engagement dinner, and at his wedding, and at every gathering where I'd shown up, and he'd had to figure out what to do with me. I could see exactly which side of it he was landing on before he said a single word. Dad. His voice came out harder than I'd ever heard him use with me, loud enough to reach the table behind him. This dinner is for the people who built this business. You can head back to the bar and I'll find you when we're done. I just stood there for a moment. The people who built this business. I heard somebody at the table make a small sound that might have been a laugh, quickly swallowed. The Atlanta clients looked at each other. Carter Whitfield still hadn't moved. 35 years of union work. A house mortgaged for a second time at 56 years old. A personal guarantee on $1.8 million signed in a bank office in Charleston while a loan officer young enough to be my son explained the risks to me. The original deed to this building had carried my name on it for 14 months before we transferred it into the LLC structure. None of the people in that room knew any of that, because Marcus had made absolutely certain they wouldn't. I didn't say any of it. That isn't who I am. I nodded once and started to turn back toward the door. That was when the event coordinator, a woman named Patricia who had worked Ironwood Hall since the first month it opened and who knew my face as well as anyone on that staff, came around the corner of the private room carrying a leather check presenter. She was in the middle of a task, not paying attention to what had happened 20 seconds earlier in the doorway, and she walked to the empty seat nearest me and set the presenter down with a professional smile. "Mr. Kowalski," she said, the way she always said it, "the evening's total whenever you're ready. 6,200. Then she turned and walked back toward the kitchen. I looked down at that presenter on the white tablecloth. Then I looked at my son. I picked it up, opened it, looked at the number, closed it again. Then I set it back down in front of Marcus's place and kept my eyes on his face while I did it. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I turned and walked back through the candlelit room, past the Atlanta clients, past Carter Whitfield's unreadable expression, past the hostess stand, and out through the front doors of the building I had helped buy, into the cold Charleston night. The drive back toward the highway was quiet in a way I hadn't felt before. Not angry quiet. Something below anger, something that had gone still and clear the way a level goes still when you've finally found the flat. I didn't turn on the radio. I drove with my hands steady on the wheel and let the lights of Charleston fall away behind me, and I thought about every moment I could remember where I had let something pass, because I told myself Marcus needed the space to build what he was building and that my job was to hold the wall up, not to stand in front of it. I thought about signing those loan documents at 56. I thought about being introduced as a family friend at my son's own wedding while Carter Whitfield shook my hand and had no idea he was looking at the man who'd made the whole thing financially possible. I thought about the articles that called Marcus a self-made entrepreneur and the particular hollow feeling of reading them in my kitchen in Millbrook alone. By the time I pulled into a motel outside of Columbia, South Carolina, something inside me had finished shifting. Not breaking. Finishing. I called my cousin Dennis the next morning. Dennis had spent 30 years as a commercial real estate attorney in Pittsburgh before he retired, and he still kept his license current and took cases that interested him. I told him I needed to sit down with him and look at the paperwork on a holding company called Ironwood Ventures, LLC. Dennis said, "Come to Pittsburgh and bring everything I had." We sat across from each other in his home office 2 days later. The loan documents and the LLC operating agreement spread across his desk. Dennis read slowly, the way he always had, asking me questions in the flat, careful voice he used when he was building a picture. I told him the whole story, without leaving anything out. He found what he was looking for about 25 minutes in. "Ray," he said, tapping a page with 2 fingers, "your personal guarantee on this loan is not open-ended. It's structured for annual renewal tied to the collateral assessment, which is your house in Millbrook. That renewal window comes up in 11 weeks. He turned 2 more pages. "And there's a clause here standard in this kind of LLC structure, but people miss it when they're young and excited, that gives either partner the right to invoke a forced valuation and either purchase the other party's stake or compel a buyout if there has been material misrepresentation of the ownership structure to third parties, which," he said, looking up at me over his reading glasses, Based on what you're telling me, has been happening for 3 years in magazine articles, and in front of the man whose family your son married into, is exactly what's been going on. I sat with that for a long moment. I told Dennis I wanted to send formal written notice that I would not be renewing my personal guarantee at the next review period. No drama, no phone call at midnight, just a clean legal letter, through the proper channels. A man removing his name from something that had never been allowed to acknowledge him in the first place. I also asked him to send a letter to Ironwood Ventures, invoking the buyout clause, giving Marcus 90 days to purchase my 35% stake at fair market value before the ownership structure would need to be disclosed through the standard filing process. Dennis nodded and said he'd have both letters ready within the week. I drove back to Millbrook feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not satisfied exactly. Settled. The kind of settled that comes when you stop waiting for something to change on its own and decide to change it yourself. The guarantee renewal letter went to the bank 8 weeks later, formal and precise, notifying them that the personal guarantee backing the Ironwood Ventures commercial loan would not be renewed under current terms, and that the collateral arrangement would expire at the review date unless new security was established. I found out from Dennis later that the bank contacted Marcus the same afternoon the letter arrived. The loan officer walked him through the document structure, the original guarantee, the collateral, the ownership arrangement, page by page. Marcus had never actually read the original loan documents closely. He'd signed where he was told to sign when he was 24 and desperate to open a venue, trusting his father the way he used to trust me to handle the parts of life he didn't understand yet. Now, 11 years later, sitting across from a bank officer in Charleston and hearing for the first time that the entire financial foundation of Ironwood Hall had been built on his father's house and his father's credit score and his father's name, on a personal guarantee for $1.8 million, Marcus was learning the real story of his own success. According to Dennis, who'd gotten a call from the bank's counsel that same week, Marcus went very quiet during that meeting. He asked to see the original guarantee document on the screen in front of him, and he sat there looking at my signature for a long time before he said anything at all. Whatever version of himself he'd built and presented to the Whitfields and to the press and to those Atlanta clients at that dinner table was sitting right there in front of him in black and white, and it didn't look the way he'd been describing it for 3 years. Marcus called me 9 times over the next 3 days. I let every call go to voicemail. Not out of spite. I just didn't have anything left to say that hadn't already been said in that doorway in Charleston. On the 4th day, he drove to Millbrook. He parked on the street outside the house he'd grown up in, which I noticed, and knocked on the front door, which I also noticed. I opened the door and found my son standing on the porch, looking like a man who hadn't slept in several days, which he probably hadn't. I let him in. I made coffee. We sat at the same kitchen table. He asked me why I was doing this after everything, after all the years I'd stayed quiet and let things go. I told him the truth. I said I wasn't doing anything to him. I was just done doing something for him that had never once been acknowledged. Done holding up a wall that wasn't allowed to have my name on it. Done being the financial foundation of a story where I didn't exist. I told him pulling the guarantee wasn't revenge. It was just the first honest thing that had happened between us in a long time. He had spent 3 years teaching me that my name and my contribution were things to be managed and hidden when they were inconvenient, and I had finally decided to stop making myself so easy to hide. He sat there for a long time without speaking. He looked at the kitchen table. He looked at his hands. I watched my son, who had filled every room he'd ever walked into since he was 19 years old, run completely out of words. It was the first time I'd seen that happen. Word about the loan situation moved faster than either of us expected through Charleston's business community, the way things do in a city that size where everyone in commercial real estate knows everyone else. Carter Whitfield heard the full account not from me but from his own attorney, who'd picked up the details through a mutual contact at the bank's legal department. Carter called Marcus directly and asked him point blank whether it was true that Ironwood Hall had been built on a personal guarantee and a property lien belonging to his father, the same father Marcus had introduced to him as a family friend who'd believed in him early on. I heard about that conversation weeks later from Sloane, who called me on a Sunday afternoon, sounding shaken in a way I hadn't heard from her before. She told me her father had built his own real estate portfolio from nothing after inheriting significant debt from his own father's failed ventures in the 90s. That the thing Carter Whitfield respected above almost anything else in a man was honesty about where you came from and acknowledgement of the people who'd helped you get somewhere. She said, discovering that Marcus's self-made story had been built on top of an erased father who'd mortgaged his house and signed $1 million guarantee had shifted something in how Carter looked at his son-in-law in a way that she didn't think was going to shift back. She said Carter used the word embarrassed, not about Marcus's background, about the concealment, about the story. The Savannah location closed within 5 months, without my guarantee as the anchor on the loan structure, and without Marcus having built sufficient personal credit history or liquid reserves to refinance independently. The bank moved on the terms. The flagship Charleston location survived, scaled back significantly, running leaner than it ever had with Marcus managing most of the operations himself. Carter Whitfield did not leave the family, but Sloan told me he'd pulled back the informal business connections and introductions he'd previously offered Marcus freely, the quiet social capital that comes with marrying into a family like that, watching now with a careful distance instead of the easy warmth he'd extended before. Marcus lost weight that year, showed up to Thanksgiving in Millbrook, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The confidence he used to carry into every room replaced by something more careful and tired. I didn't feel good watching it. I want to be honest about that. I had loved that boy since before he could walk, and watching any part of his life come apart didn't feel like anything except painful. But I also didn't step in to soften it. Because for the first time in his adult life, Marcus was standing in the full weight of consequences that belonged to him, without his father quietly positioned behind him, absorbing the pressure. He came back to Millbrook on a Saturday in March, parked on the street again, knocked on the door again. He looked better than he had at Thanksgiving, still tired, but present in a way he hadn't been. We sat on the back steps where I used to pitch him wiffle balls when he was 8 years old. He talked for almost an hour. He told me he'd been ashamed of where we came from since he was in middle school, ashamed of the truck and the union hall and the way I smelled when I came home from a job, and that the shame had turned into something he'd built his entire adult identity on top of without ever examining it. He said he understood now that building that identity had meant erasing the only person who had shown up for him every single day, without conditions or hesitation. And he said he was sorry in the plain way that people say things when they've finally stopped managing how they sound and are just saying what's true. I told him I appreciated hearing it and that I believed him. And I told him that things were not going back to the way they had been before that night in Charleston. If he wanted me in his life going forward, it was going to be as his father, out loud, in whatever room we happened to be standing in front of whoever was at the table, not as a family friend, not as a quiet arrangement that got managed out of the narrative when the room felt too important, as his father. He nodded. Then he leaned over and hugged me the way he used to when he was small, without thinking about it, without performing it for anyone. Just two people on a back porch in Millbrook finding their way back towards something honest. It's been almost a year since that dinner at Ironwood Hall. Things look different than they used to, though not in the way anybody would have predicted from the outside. Marcus runs the Charleston location himself now. Working hours I recognize because I worked the same ones when he was growing up and watching me leave the house before sunrise. He calls me most weeks. Real calls, not logistics calls. He came up to Millbrook in October, and we watched a Pirates game on my cracked old television and ate takeout on the couch, and he didn't feel the need to make anything out of it. It was just a Sunday. Last month, he called me before a meeting with a new events coordinator he was bringing on, and he asked if I wanted to drive down and sit in. When we walked into Ironwood Hall together and the staff came around to say hello, Marcus introduced me to the coordinator the same way, without pause, without editing, without the careful sideways glance he used to give rooms before deciding what to do with my presence. "This is my dad," he said. "He's the reason any of this exists. I still drive the same truck. I still come home from jobs with the smell of copper on my hands. But I sit at whatever table I'm invited to without wondering whether I'm going to be asked to wait somewhere else. Because Marcus finally understands what it costs to build a life. And he stopped letting that cost belong to someone he was pretending he didn't need."